They came to our quiet neighborhood dressed like authority figures, badges flashing, uniforms crisp, voices sharp. But they weren't real cops. They were imposters, self-appointed enforcers claiming to represent the HOA. And when my wife dared to question them, things turned violent in an instant. Imagine thinking your home is your sanctuary, only to find strangers at your door, trying to control you, intimidate you, and even lay hands on your family. But here's the twist: had no idea who they were up against. Because the man standing behind that door wasn't just a husband, he was a Navy SEAL. And what happened next? You won't believe it. At first, life in the neighborhood seemed almost picture-perfect. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses that looked like they were copied from the same glossy magazine. It was the kind of place where families felt safe, where kids could ride their bikes without worry, and where neighbors waved politely as they passed. For a young couple just starting to build their life together, it felt like the dream community, quiet, orderly, and full of promise. They had worked hard for this home. Every detail, from the garden they planted to the porch where they sipped their morning coffee, carried meaning. It wasn't just property, it was stability, safety, and pride. And for a while, it really did feel like nothing could disturb that peace. But beneath the manicured lawns and carefully enforced rules, cracks were already forming. The HOA was ever present, always watching. Notices tucked under windshield wipers, letters mailed about the tiniest violations, whispers about neighbors who didn't fit in. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore, but the signs were there, foreshadowing what was to come. Because in communities like this, order can quickly turn into control. And when people begin to believe they hold authority over others, the results can spiral out of control. What started as a place of comfort was about to become a battleground, and one shocking encounter would shatter the illusion of safety forever. At first, the notices seemed harmless. A small envelope slipped into the mailbox, politely reminding the couple that their trash bins needed to be pulled in sooner. They shrugged it off. After all, wasn't that the whole point of an HOA, to keep things orderly? But when the second letter arrived, it wasn't so polite. This time it was a formal violation, complete with a threat of fines. The supposed offense, a garden hose left coiled beside the garage. It was barely visible from the street, but to the HOA it was apparently a matter of community aesthetics. They tried to comply. They adjusted, tightened, and followed rules as best they could. But compliance only seemed to make the HOA bolder. Each week brought a new complaint: weeds that weren't there, paint that wasn't the right shade, a lawn too long even after mowing. What had once felt like small corrections now carried the weight of harassment. And it wasn't just the notices. It was the constant feeling of being watched. Cars slowed as they drove by. Neighbors whispered. The community that had once felt safe began to feel like a surveillance zone. One morning, the couple found a letter taped directly to their front door, a step beyond the usual mailed notice. This one was bolder, angrier, almost taunting. It accused them of breaking community standards by hosting unauthorized guests. But these so-called guests weren't strangers. They were family members visiting for the weekend, staying just 2 nights. Still, the HOA framed it as if they had turned their home into some kind of illegal boarding house. The message was clear. Every move, every decision, was subject to control. As the violations piled up, so did the fines. Small, at first, but they grew with each supposed offense. $50 for the hose, $100 for the guest rule, 204 grass clippings left too close to the curb. Soon, the total was staggering. Thousands of dollars demanded for offenses so petty they bordered on absurd. For most families, it would have been enough to break their resolve, to push them into quiet compliance. But this wasn't a family that backed down. The husband, a man who had endured grueling training and life-or-death missions as a Navy SEAL, wasn't intimidated by paperwork and threats. But here, it wasn't about missions or tactics. It was about his family, his home, and the principle that no one should be bullied into submission. He began to push back, filing appeals, challenging the board, documenting every notice and every interaction. And that's when the harassment shifted from passive-aggressive letters to something much darker. They began to notice strange cars idling at the end of their street late at night, flashlights flickering near their backyard fence, anonymous calls with no voice on the other end. And then, the most brazen move yet, individuals dressed in security-like uniforms arriving at their door, claiming to be community enforcement officers. They carried themselves with the authority of police, but something was off. Their badges were unrecognizable, their paperwork vague, their threats unusually personal. When his wife opened the door one afternoon, they didn't speak with the measured calm of officials. They barked accusations, demanding entry, insisting they were in violation of rules that didn't even exist in the bylaws. And when she resisted, one of them crossed a line no one could have imagined. He laid a hand on her. It was quick, a shove meant to intimidate, but it was enough to shatter any illusion that these men were legitimate. The moment burned into her mind, the shock, the fear, the betrayal of safety on her own doorstep. She stumbled back, heart pounding while they stood smirking as if daring her to fight back. What they didn't realize was that her husband was just steps away, watching everything unfold. The rising tension had reached its breaking point. For weeks the HOA had pushed boundaries, inch by inch, testing limits. Now in a single reckless act, they had crossed the line entirely. The balance of power was about to shift, and the so-called enforcers had no idea what storm they had just unleashed. Because this wasn't just a dispute over paint colors or lawn height anymore. This was an attack on family, on dignity, on the very sense of security inside one's own home. And if the HOA thought their intimidation tactics would break this family, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The neighborhood had been watching, some quietly approving of the HOA's authority, others whispering their doubts but too afraid to speak up. Now, everyone was about to witness what happens when power is abused too far and when the wrong family is pushed into a corner. And as the husband stepped forward, the tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. What would happen? Next would not just decide the fate of their home, but expose the lengths some people will go to in the name of control. The moment the so-called enforcers laid hands on his wife, everything changed. The husband had watched silently for weeks, holding back his anger, playing by the rules, documenting every notice, every threat. But this was no longer about letters in the mail or fines that could be contested in court. This was a violation of the most sacred boundary, his family's safety. And for a Navy SEAL who had trained his entire life to protect, was a line no one crossed. He stepped out onto the porch, his presence immediate, unflinching, the kind that made even grown men hesitate. The imposters tried to stand their ground, puffing themselves up, tossing out official-sounding phrases as if their words could shield them. But he saw it instantly, the nervous flicker in their eyes, the way their hands twitched, the slight tremble in their voices. They were bullies in costumes, nothing more. The air seemed to thicken. The wife's shock turned into something else now, a mix of fear and relief, knowing she wasn't alone in this moment. Neighbors began peeking from behind curtains, drawn by the raised voices and the tense standoff forming at the edge of the driveway. What had once been whispered rumors about HOA power now stood in the open for everyone to see. Then came the confrontation, with a voice that cut through the evening air. The husband demanded proof of authority, badges, documentation, anything legitimate. They had none. Their bluff was collapsing, and when one of them tried to step closer, to reassert control through intimidation, it backfired spectacularly. The husband's training kicked in, controlled, precise, and decisive. In seconds, the enforcers who had strutted so confidently were scrambling, stumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the facade of power crumbled. These weren't officers. They weren't protectors of order. They were frauds, bullies acting under the HOA's shadow, and now everyone could see it. The confrontation that was meant to scare one family had turned into a public unmasking. And yet, the real blow hadn't landed yet, because while the physical encounter exposed their weakness, the husband had prepared something far more devastating. Weeks of documentation, photos, recordings, and evidence had been compiled. And now, with witnesses standing all around, he laid it bare: the fraudulent notices, the unlawful fines, the manufactured rules, and finally, the HOA's desperate attempt to enforce its will through intimidation and impersonation. The froze. The board members hiding behind them froze, and the neighbors who had once looked away now leaned in, realizing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The HOA had overplayed its hand. They hadn't just crossed a line, they had obliterated it. This was no longer about grass length or trash bins. It was about corruption, abuse of power, and the lengths people will go when they think no one will stand against them. And in that moment, as the so-called authority figures retreated in disgrace, one truth rang louder than any shouted word or slammed notice. The balance of power had shifted. The HOA had tried to break this family. Instead, they had broken themselves. But the battle wasn't over, because while the imposters fled and the neighbors whispered, the real question hung heavy in the air. What would happen when the board itself was forced to answer for everything that had been exposed? That moment was coming, and it would be even more devastating than the confrontation on the porch. The imposters fled that evening, stumbling back into their unmarked cars, their fake uniforms no longer carrying the weight they once pretended to wield. The neighborhood was left in stunned silence. Curtains that had once been drawn back quickly fell shut again. For a moment, it seemed as if the street itself was holding its breath. The performance was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The husband didn't let the matter rest there. He knew intimidation thrives in silence. That power, like the HOAS, survives only when neighbors whisper instead of speak, when families comply out of fear rather than stand their ground. And he had no intention of letting what happened to his wife fade into rumor. Instead, he turned every shred of evidence he'd gathered, the notices, the photos, the recordings, and now the public witnesses of that night, into a case too strong to ignore. Within days, complaints were filed, not with the HOA, but with the county, with state regulators, with law enforcement agencies that actually carried authority. The fraudulent uniforms, the impersonation of police officers, the harassment, all of it crossed lines, not just of decency, but of the law itself. The board scrambled. Letters were suddenly softer in tone. Calls for fines abruptly suspended. The very people who had once issued threats with iron confidence now found themselves dodging calls, refusing meetings, hiding behind legal jargon that no longer held weight. Neighbors began to talk, really talk, for the first time in months. Stories poured out about fines for Christmas lights, about threats for minor landscaping choices, about constant surveillance that left people anxious in their own homes. The HOA's iron grip had thrived because everyone believed they were alone, but once the silence cracked, the entire neighborhood saw just how widespread the abuse had been. And then came the board meeting. It was supposed to be routine, a sterile gathering where decisions were handed down without debate. But that night, the room was packed. Families who had never shown up before filled every seat, standing shoulder to shoulder, buzzing with quiet anger and anticipation. And at the center of it all, the Navy SEAL and his wife sat calmly, waiting for their moment. When the husband spoke, the room fell silent. He didn't shout, he didn't posture. He laid out the truth in cold, precise, detailed, every notice, every violation, every manufactured fine, the impersonators and their assault. Piece by piece, the board's carefully constructed facade crumbled. By the time he finished, the weight of silence in the room wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. Neighbors who had once complied out of intimidation now found their voices. One after another, they stood up, telling their stories, piling evidence onto the growing mountain against the board. What had been designed as a meeting of control became a tribunal of accountability. The HOA leaders sat exposed, cornered not by one family, but by the very community they had claimed to represent. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Board members resigned, some quietly, others in disgrace. The so-called enforcers were investigated, facing charges for impersonation and harassment. The bylaws once weaponized as tools of control were reviewed and rewritten, stripped of the vague, predatory language that had given the board so much unchecked power. For the first time in years, the community began to feel like a neighborhood. Again, not a battleground. For the couple, the resolution brought more than relief. It brought vindication. Their home, once under siege, became a symbol of resilience. The porch where the confrontation had taken place wasn't just a reminder of fear. Anymore, it was a reminder of the night power shifted. The night intimidation failed, but the impact reached beyond one family or one HOA. Word spread, as stories like this often do. Neighbors in other communities began to share it, recognizing pieces of their own struggles in the tale. It became a rallying cry, a reminder that rules and order only hold legitimacy when they are fair, transparent, and rooted in respect. The abuse of authority, no matter how small it begins, always grows if left unchecked. And sometimes, all it takes is one family unwilling to back down to turn the tide. Looking back, the couple often thought about how easily it could have gone differently. If they had stayed silent, if they had paid the fines quietly, if they had accepted intimidation as the price of living in a nice neighborhood, their peace would have eroded piece by piece, until home no longer felt like home at all. Instead, they chose to fight, not with anger or recklessness, but with persistence, documentation, and the unshakable resolve to protect what mattered. Most. The takeaway was clear. Communities don't thrive when they're ruled by fear. They thrive when neighbors stand together, when authority is questioned, and when rules serve the people, not the other way around. As for the Navy SEAL husband, his calm strength became the story's anchor. He hadn't just defended his wife. From an immediate threat, he had exposed a system of control that had poisoned the very place they had chosen to build their life. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching of a truth far more powerful than any bylaw or board ruling. Families don't need permission to feel safe in their own homes. In the end, the HOA's reign of fear collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. The board that had once issued fines with smug certainty now existed only as a cautionary tale. The neighborhood, once fractured by suspicion and silence, slowly stitched itself back together. Children returned to the sidewalks. Families decorated their homes without fear of reprimand. And the street, once watched over by the eyes of enforcers, was finally watched over by the people who truly lived there. But perhaps the greatest impact was not on the HOA or the neighborhood. It was on the people watching, listening, and learning. Because every viewer who hears this story is left with the same pressing question. If it happened here, could it happen where I live? And if it did, would I have the courage to stand up, to fight back, to protect my home the way they did? That's the lasting legacy of this story. Not just the defeat of an overreaching HOA, but the reminder that strength doesn't always come from positions of authority. Sometimes, it comes from ordinary people refusing to bow to intimidation. Sometimes, it comes from one family saying enough, and meaning it so as the dust settled. As the neighborhood found its footing again, one truth remained undeniable. The HOA had underestimated the wrong family. They thought they could bully, intimidate, and silence. Instead, they exposed themselves to the one thing they feared most: accountability. And for everyone who has ever felt powerless under the weight of petty rules, arbitrary fines, or unfair authority, this story serves as both a warning and an invitation, a warning of how far things can spiral when power goes unchecked, and an invitation to remember that even in the face of overwhelming control, resistance is possible, change is possible, and justice is possible, because in the end, this wasn't just about a house. It wasn't even just about one family. It was about the principle that no one, not even an HOA board, has the right to strip people of their dignity, their peace, or their sense of home. Then so, the story closes, not with fear, but with triumph. The HOA may have written the rules, but this family wrote the ending.